Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on U.S. foreign policy and global politics. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be back. So we're recording this on December 23rd, 2021.
One of the themes for this show is reflecting on 2021. And I was wondering if you, Ryan, had any reflections you wanted to share on the year and why you felt that now was the right time to begin this podcast.
I think when we look back at 2021, especially, as an American, so much is defined by what's going on domestically. I mean, the year began in kind of brutal fashion on January 6th with the insurrection at the Capitol. And obviously, COVID has been a huge theme, and domestically, the great disappointment kind of around not being over. Everybody thought that COVID was done. It was going to be hot fact summer, and we were going to get back to our normal lives. But at the same time, so we have all this kind of domestic tensions, but, within both of those kind of big themes, I mean, these are also global phenomenon. Obviously, the United States, still the most powerful country in the world. What goes on domestically, influences and affects the politics of other countries as well. And that's something that I think isn't really well reflected within the media here domestically anymore. I mean, I think what we've seen is kind of, between budget cuts at media outlets, that their international news coverage isn't what it used to be. I'm thinking, outlets like CNN, which kind of made their name that way. So yeah, there's just really this kind of gap of understanding how everything is connected despite the period under Trump and kind of the retrenchment of globalism and trade. We're still very much interlinked, and that includes ideas. Because we've seen, populism spread throughout Europe, throughout South America, parts of Asia, and it kind of feeds on each other. It's this loop, and kind of understanding those connections. Obviously, COVID is a huge global problem, and the reason we're having these variants break out is because of insufficient global response. So I think in terms of a podcast and one focused on global politics, I mean, I think this is a great time, and hopefully, to our audience, meets some sort of unmet demand that's out there that kind of addresses these issues.
Well, on today's episode, we will be covering the main news from December 11th to December 23rd. In this segment, we begin with the latest updates to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Next, Ryan leads the discussion on new developments on the consideration of nuclear power and surging LNG demand. In our second segment, we reflect on two of the most significant stories of the year: the global distribution of vaccines for coronavirus and the U.S. strategy towards a rising China. So, taking on our first topic, the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Taking off from where we were last episode, Russia has defined its terms and what it wants, and it has demanded that there is a ban on Ukraine and other countries entering NATO. They want limits on weapons and troops deployed to Eastern NATO countries, and they want NATO to get permission from Russia to conduct exercises in border countries. For NATO, as you might expect, the US and NATO, these are pretty much non-starters. But they have agreed to negotiate with Russia, with the US and Russia having bilateral talks in January. So I think in some sense, this is what Russia gets out of it. It got the bilateral talks. So it can express its concerns, and NATO has to engage with it instead of just doing what it wants, without Russia as part of the conversation.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, that's part of what Russia is seeking, is just kind of open discussion around these items. I think the real question is, where will the points of agreement actually be? Because essentially this list is saying, I mean, the first one, fine, ban on the Ukraine, other countries entering NATO. I mean, Russia's stated that for a long time. But then everything beyond that is beyond ridiculous. I mean, part of the reason of joining NATO, joining EU, these are independent nation states that have full rights to determine what their national defense policies are and what programs they participate in. So saying that they need permission from Russia to conduct exercises with their allies if it happens to border Russia is, obviously a non-starter. So kind of what areas of agreement are they actually going to find when they sit down in January to de-escalate? Because ultimately, if they're hoping to find a diplomatic solution, we talked a little bit about the stick portion, which is kind of the economic sanctions. I think there's a lot of flaws with that. But then what out of this list of things can NATO possibly agree to that leads to a de-escalation of the situation? That, from my understanding from some of the articles I've read, that's kind of the issue and potential problem going forward is, hey, what are we going to actually get out of these January negotiations?
For whom? NATO or Russia?
Kind of for both parties. Where are they going to find that off-ramp to de-escalate? And we talked about this last week some, and I think part of it is putting enough pressure on Russia that when you do offer it an off-ramp, and maybe there is something kind of buried within this list of demands, you can certainly go and kind of hedge what you're saying with the Ukraine and put it kind of maybe some sort of agreement to put that in the back burner and then kind of have this more bilateral relationship with the Ukraine where you accomplish the same things in terms of strengthening their democracy, strengthening their economy, and integrating them more fully within the EU without formally doing so. But, at least, Russia has a domestic victory of saying, oh, we made the West kind of back off and they're no longer talking about NATO entry for the Ukraine. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it can easily be something like that. I wonder if there's some give on the idea of exercises in border countries. Because we do, unless they're like defined enemy like North Korea, you do have some buffer between the borders of countries when you do these sort of military exercises. So it's not unreasonable to say that Russia doesn't want that on its border.
Yeah, but I think what we have to be careful in terms of accepting is that you're not allowing them to kind of reestablish sphere of influence over the Soviet bloc. Because when we're talking about border country, we're talking about Poland. We're talking about the Baltic states. These are governments that are fully supportive and enthusiastic members of NATO. So dictating kind of domestic policy because of this, that just kind of smacks. But I think where you could compromise is maybe like certain types of exercises or certain types of weapon systems that aren't necessarily deployed. But being able to not conduct exercises, realistic exercises for defense purposes, I think that's too much.
How is that a term of their national policy? Part of being in NATO, they don't have militaries big enough to defend themselves. And so part of being in NATO includes, you cede some of your pure autonomy militarily. I just don't understand why that isn't, to some degree, some part of that reasonable.
I would think, at least from what I've read on kind of the Polish stance, that would be a non-starter. I don't know about the Baltic states. But yeah, it's infringing on domestic national security of these nations. And they do have big enough standing armies to where there would be, some preponderance of the force. The Polish are going to defend their territory. So but I think there is when you get into like the technical nuances, certain anti-missile systems and weapon systems and exactly what you deploy at those border areas, maybe that's where you find the compromise, where Russia feels like it gets some sort of victory. It shows that NATO's kind of backing off, but you're not really infringing on the domestic and national security rights of these countries and their autonomy.
Yeah. As I said last week, I think we need to get through the ones that are demands that are rational, that any country would want for its security, and separate that from the kind of ridiculousness of some of the demands that are just not going to happen. And I think on most of these, there's a middle pathway. Like the way Russia has it, you can define it in the furthest terms. And that's, of course, like no one is definitely going to do that. Like serious limits on weapons and troops to Eastern NATO countries.
It's a negotiation.
Yeah.
And this is where you anchor.
Right.
You anchor yourself on one far end, and then you come towards the middle.
So I think this was good for Putin, but maybe good for the West too. A lot of articles that I've been reading on this as well hinged on whether Europe really had a way to effectively deter any conflict. But I think that also kind of misses the entire point, because it doesn't also discuss what cost Russia incurs from actually invading Ukraine. So if, when we're talking about negotiations, again, I just think these articles relied on their analysis too much of what Europe has to deter, because Russia definitely, it's not just economic sanctions. There are serious costs to Russia to do this invasion. And I think understanding that on both sides will help them get to some agreement. I feel pretty positive on this, that there will be an agreement. It probably will take forever, but it makes me feel even more secure in my thinking that it's very unlikely there'll be an invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, putting out a list of demands and signaling and being open to talks shows that, this is all kind of a positioning and a posture for Russia, that it knows getting in a quagmire of actually going outside of the Donbass region, which already controls effectively anyway, but trying to overthrow the administration in Kiev, it's a non-starter. It's too costly.
Yeah, so I think it's actually positive that they came out with their list of demands. Again, as I was reading this through the week, I just saw really negative on the kinds of demands. But the positive side is that it's much harder to deal with these things when you don't exactly know what the other side wants, right? That's much harder to decide, what are we going to do to prevent the invasion if we don't know what Russia wants, if we don't know what Russia's game plan here. And so by giving out a list of demands, no matter what they are, actually sets us up for negotiation in a way that was uncertain before.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it goes back to the old, I don't know who in the military kind of had this quote, but jaw is better than war. So it's anytime you have an off-ramp and your adversary is willing to talk through it. Now, mind you, there are a lot of quotes out there, the Russians, right? Yeah, we don't want the EU and NATO and US to drag this out into a marathon sort of discussion. So I don't know, in terms of that as a tactic may not work, but I think it's positive development for sure.
Definitely. Okay, so on to the next topic, which is something you know a lot more about, which is on nuclear power renewal and surging LNG demand.
Yeah, so I think, this has been something that's even kind of penetrated the domestic audience here in the U.S. in terms of, the seeming reemergence of nuclear power as an option after essentially being dormant for 3 decades of not building new plants. You begin to see, within the U.S. both on TV and on radio, kind of advertising NuScale, which is a U.S.-based nuclear company that is looking to build kind of new, smaller designed nuclear plants. But what really was leading this off is we had an article a week ago where President of France, Macron, announced the relaunch of nuclear reaction construction. And this is really the first time in decades, even in France, which gets, over 60% of its total energy from nuclear sources. And what they're doing is really pushing this new design. So these smaller modular reactors, which, France, but both the, companies in the US, the UK, Russia, and Canada have taken a lead to. And essentially they're a lot smaller and they have a lot of fail safes because obviously, the biggest thing that has always kind of quashed any sort of nuclear renaissance. First, you had the 3 Mile accident not too far from here in 3 Mile, Pennsylvania. And then Chernobyl, of course. And then most recently, Fukushima in Japan.
2 questions. First of all, what kind of fail-safe are you talking about?
Yeah, so these are just in terms of the design, it doesn't require human intervention. So these are engineered solutions, which are always better than kind of administrative solutions in terms of a safety. So if you have any sort, they're essentially either built underground or they're submerged in water already. So you don't have the situation of an uncontrolled reaction happening similar to Chernobyl, for instance.
Right. And my second question is, this company, does it have models of building these, or does it have like an actual functioning one?
I mean, these are the same sort of models that have been on U.S. nuclear subs for generations. So you have these kind of small contained nuclear reactors that have existed. But what you're seeing really now is a lot of innovation, a lot of new money being poured into it. In fact, $8.5 billion of the infrastructure package that was passed by Congress and the Biden administration is dedicated towards nuclear power, of which the Department of Energy is funding about half of that for these new designs. And that's kind of where companies like NuScale, so US-based NuScale, has come in. They already have NRC approval. So that's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the regulatory body overseeing all nuclear production within the US. So they're building a pilot project, actually first in Romania, and that's scheduled for 2027. And then you've also seen China, which is competing on the smaller reactor designs. And they actually have a unit going on in Shandong this year. So these new, smaller modular designs are gaining traction. Now, mind you, most of the new ones have happened in China at this point. But yeah, so it definitely offers a potential. Obviously, the benefit of nuclear power in the age of climate change, the lack of CO2 associated with it. I think the other big thing and what this design hopes to overcome is the cost. Unfortunately, the levelized cost of energy generation, which is just a common way to look at different energy sources, nuclear is way at the top. And it's actually the only energy source that has grown in cost in terms of like per megawatt hour generated over the last 2 decades. So it really has a issue of why should we invest in this over, natural gas generated plants or renewables like solar and wind. But this new design, supposedly, if it's modular and smaller, then you should be able to cut costs in half and actually make it competitive with other energy sources.
I mean, I'm still a little skeptical because what I've been reading is some of these promises for a certain cost structure, and then it goes like way, way over that. So I feel like when I see a successful one built, then maybe I'll be more enthusiastic about this. But right now, I'm very skeptical. And that's just the technological problem of it. Good luck finding anywhere in the United States where you can build one. I mean, no one is going to want one anywhere near their neighborhoods. So...
part of it is overcoming that perception. And I think the article, which we'll post the link to, I think this is in the Financial Times, really highlighted that effect of not in my backyard. And it was in the border region in Alsace between France and Germany. And a nuclear plant kind of essentially existed in France for the longest times. And it became the object of the anti-nuclear movement in the town on the German side. And they held celebrations when this nuclear plant closed down. So the article really focused on, with this new plant, could our town then, which, lost 2,000 jobs on the French side and was pretty devastating to that community, could we build in one of these new reactors? And a lot of the town folks are like, the German reaction would just be pretty severe, the backlash against that. And I think, so this is really, I agree with you, this is really a trial pilot period. That's why the DOE is putting money into it. That's why the Gates Foundation is putting money into it, because there has to be a proof of concept that, one, you can achieve that level of cost reduction. And then two, you have that public perception and to say, hey, this isn't like these old design plants. It's far, far safer and produces far less waste.
Well, it's hard to spend time with you and not have heard all the great promises of nuclear power. I guess these are the technical reasons that I'm skeptical. I don't know. I guess we'll see. I don't know. I still have a lot of reservations.
It's really an issue of the cost. But I think, there's potential there. And long term, there's always that, hey, fusion is always 20, 30 years off. But, as a society, I think, these are the right things to push towards still.
I do think energy demand does kind of open this door for sure. So part of this was also the story about a recent deal between the United States and China on exporting LNG.
Yes, I think, we talked about in the last episode around cooperation. And the few areas of cooperations between the U.S. and China was around the strategic release of oil reserves that we saw in the last month. Well, this is another area. So China is, obviously has a lot of active coal plants, a lot of growth in energy demand, but also, domestic unrest around the pollution, particularly just the air quality levels within the cities. So huge demand for natural gas. And, that's benefited a lot U.S. producers who, after decades of kind of work in the background, finally have the capacity to export a significant amount of LNG. So they recently signed a number of pretty big long-term contracts for LNG export to China. So and again, it was something that Biden and Xi in their last conversation talked about. And it's really a positive benefit on the climate change side too, because this will keep them, maybe they're not shutting down coal plants, but they'll build less new coal plants because of these LNG exports. So it's just seen as, another way where you have areas of cooperation between the two.
See, this whole story though made me just think of so much shouldn't even be a separate issue of cooperation, right? This is just like the fundamentals of liberalism and trade. We'll talk about John Marsheimer, who is the father of offensive realism, basically that countries zero-sum want just power, and just makes fun of liberalism. And I say makes fun like he just calls it a fantasy. But basically, this is how it works. One country has a lot of energy, the other one needs it. And they both gain something from it. I feel like too many people have irresponsibly let the conversation on global trade be zero-sum. They took our jobs. Maybe we got cheap stuff from it, but they took our jobs. Obviously, not the real story. It's a complex story that includes technological innovations. It's not saying that all the gains are equally distributed within or between countries, but it does say that everything doesn't have to be zero-sum, that we can engage and both be better for it. I mean, this is just one example. And then when conflicts arise, it gives us more things to be like disincentives to engage in military conflict and to choose other forms to negotiate differences, right? So if China's getting a lot of its energy from the United States, that de-incentivizes it from wanting to engage in military conflict. So this has been my concern whenever we talk about China. We'll talk about this more later, but when we talk about decoupling trade with China because we're worried about externalities, well, then we are getting rid of the disincentive we have for military conflict, right? If you decouple, if you don't look for deals like this, then what is to stop countries from using military force? But if you are both going to lose out, then you are much more likely to find non-military ways. And sometimes it is a trade war. Trade wars can be dangerous along that front, but limitedly, they can vent frustrations. There's all sorts of ways that you can have conflict without decoupling globalization or the larger global infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think this was one of the Biden administration has kept in a lot of the sanctions on Chinese goods, but this is one around gas that they actually, I think, modified.
Because we want to make money, right?
Yeah, we're growing. It's, huge gain. I'd say the only thing that there is pushback for is, it is going to equalize prices over time between the domestic prices are very, very low here in the United States and the international prices in Asia and Europe where we export this gas. And that was actually a point that Elizabeth Warren made and got a little bit of pushback from the industry about over the past couple of weeks. But, in terms of climate change, this is definitely the right action. I mean, if you're able to offset or reduce the number of coal plants in China, that has a huge impact for sure on CO2 production.
Right. So again, a benefit. We are making a whole lot of money. Warren's comments are true because that is the part of trade, right? When you are trading, your domestic markets do eventually equalize to the international markets, international price.
Yeah, around a global commodity.
Right,
yeah.
Right. But we've been developing this industry to export for years now. I think, again, I'm a big believer of go for the benefits of trade and then worry about or figure out, commit to redistribution, right? So if prices go higher, then you need to find ways to, again, make sure that the people who most need it are compensated for the extra prices. And we do that because the companies themselves, companies and the people who work for these gas companies are going to make huge profits. And there's nothing wrong with making profits, except if you don't agree that some part of it needs to be redistributed through society.
Yeah, and I think, rising prices also provides further incentives to renewables. I mean, that's part of the big driver for the dropping cost of solar panels, of batteries. I mean, I read today batteries have dropped like 98% in terms of the cost over the last 20 years, which is extraordinary, to the point where you're only probably a couple years off from electric vehicles being exactly the same price as internal combustion. So that's just kind of extraordinary. But you need that demand, you need that competition to kind of drive that innovation.
Yeah, exactly. So even though it's only our second episode, it is the end of December, and it seemed to make sense to reflect on the biggest issues of the year. And of course, how could you talk about anything without talking about COVID? And in particular, as it's in its second year, vaccine diplomacy and inequalities of COVID on a global scale.
Yeah, so, I mean, the whole story around kind of vaccine diplomacy is one kind of focused on, again, the great power competition between the U.S. and China, which we'll talk more about kind of in our later segment. But, when this began, it was really seen as an opportunity, particularly for the U.S. and its allies with the emergence of the more effective mRNA vaccines and, having a World War II type push of manufacturing ability to deliver, vaccines through primarily UN organizations, through the COVAX consortium, which was an agreement of a number of primarily developed nations to donate vaccines. They originally had a goal of 2.3 billion by this year's end and deliver those to the developing world. However, what we've seen is, falling well short of that goal. So of that 2.3 billion, only 800 million have been delivered and has been, frankly, eclipsed by the Chinese, particularly in Asia and to a lesser extent in South America and Africa. Now, I think what's been interesting here and maybe where there's an opportunity, again, for the U.S. and its allies, but doesn't seem at all well prepared to take advantage of it, is the emergence of the Omicron variant, which has shown to be, rather the Sinopharm vaccine has shown to be pretty ineffective against this new variant, producing almost no antibody production based on a recent Hong Kong study, as opposed to the Pfizer and the Moderna. So the mRNA vaccines, particularly with the booster, are up to 80% or more effective against Omicron. So it's been kind of an up and down story, but mostly one of global failure to respond in terms of vaccine distribution and getting it. And that's something China, honestly, has been a lot more effective at in terms of, you could say, hey, Sinopharm vaccine isn't very effective. I mean, it was obviously good against the Wuhan variant. I think it was okay against the UK variant. Was moderately effective with Delta, but they were there. They had a presence in Africa. They have a presence in South America. They're getting vaccines in people's arms. And you haven't seen that to the extent with COVAX, which is the primary vehicle that the U.S. is using to distribute vaccines.
And I think there still isn't enough urgency or even empathy being shown. We're so, again, with populism and nationalism on the rise, no one's strongly countering, saying, also, we need to protect us, but we also need to be working harder to protect those around the globe. And we always seem to be less interested in that. I mean, we're not even talking it up very much. Whereas, effective or not, people are desperate for vaccines, right? I mean, like in February and March, when vaccines first came out, how hard it was to get one because everybody wanted one, right? I mean, it's hugely protects you against getting these diseases, which are either deadly or have long-term side effects, which are also hard in these underdeveloped countries or developing countries because of their healthcare systems. And so they're willing to take it from whoever's offering, and China is the only one offering in most of these cases. I mean, to only produce 800 million doses, far from the pledge of 2.3 billion, is something we should be ashamed of. The global West, I think, in this sense, has a lot to answer for in the long-term structure of global society. And one of the promises of the current order is some sort of cooperation, that we don't want it just to be the worlds of haves and have-nots. And we aren't doing anything at all to back that up, or we haven't put any priority on it. And because we're not putting priority on it, it hasn't happened. Just this week, it's funny because we do still blame China for some reason for its quid pro quo. So the BBC had, this was December 13th, was talking about how Nicaragua cut its ties with Taiwan and then received 100 million COVID vaccines from China. And that's not surprising, right? It's not even something that the U.S. hasn't done in the past with other forms of aid. But also, they have the opportunity to do it because we're not giving them anything at all. And we should be able to provide these free or nearly free to these countries. I feel like we have just so gotten lost in any sort of development agenda, developing other countries. And this idea that it's just charity is not just charity, right? It's in our own interest, contrast to Mersheimer, it's in our own interest to build up these societies and have them prosperous and, not suffering poverty, instability, things that then affect, the rest of the world through, migrants, more violence spreading from these countries. There's a lot of concern among international security experts of internal violence because of climate change and ability to live there. The violence moves elsewhere to other countries. So I always believe, and the economist side of me always believes that we should be empathetic, right? We should care about this. We should just care. But even if we don't care, then we should see that there are numerous benefits that are good for everyone. And the development of Omicron is an obvious example of this, right? This is a global virus, this is a pandemic. It's not like we can ever get over it in Western countries and then still have it run ravage in other countries. As long as they are unvaccinated, as long as they are unprotected, then of course you're going to have mutations. It's a type of disease that they've been telling us from the beginning is always mutating. And you hope that whatever it mutates, whatever variants aren't harmful, aren't more contagious, more deadly. But likely variants are going to develop that are like Omicron. And these variants are going to keep happening, right? I mean, and even I know I felt at a certain point this year when Delta waves were waning, and I was like, well, I don't see anything happening in Europe. So it doesn't feel like there's another, version or wave on the way. And of course, that was 2 weeks before Omicron. And it is both discouraging, it's harmful to our economies, it's harmful to the health of people, and it's an embarrassment for the West. And then I was reading the more details on, well, when we lifted these patents, why are the vaccines then not being actually made in Latin America and these other places that do have the companies and the materials to be able to produce it? So I was just looking at Moderna, which has gotten some attention, and how it has refused to give a license to its vaccine to the NIH, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, essentially, I mean, both Pfizer and Moderna, a lot of companies rest on the basic research funded by the federal government. So in this case, the key aspects of the mRNA vaccine were co-developed with the NIH, so they should have part ownership and receive some of the royalties and revenue from that. But Moderna is kind of pushing back against that. I think the other negative thing Moderna is doing, besides the not releasing its IP for global manufacturing, is keeping prices well above the cost of production, which Pfizer, to its credit, has done. So Moderna essentially is only affordable to the developed world,
which is irrehensible. I mean, I expect companies to be evil. I was like, every time people tell me Facebook is evil, I'm like, well, corporations do prioritize profit, although they're not all as evil as some. But that's the role of government in certain circumstances, to intervene, right? You want capitalism to work, but sometimes capitalism doesn't work, especially when you have these near monopolies. And obviously, Moderna feels like it's in a position of power, but there should be more pressure on it to provide lower costs, more like Pfizer. I mean, so much of the money they're making is from the government itself directly, what they're billing the government. And the more important thing is to share the patents for production. I was also then looking just now in the stories, and that how China's also set up a lot of manufacturing capacity in other countries, such in Latin America, which was supposed to be happening with the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines.
Yeah, and I think you've had it to a certain extent, but I think it becomes more and more critical, as these variants emerge, and obviously it's in our material self-interest to address them as quickly as possible and get people vaccinated so you don't have this population, this number of mutations occurring. But it seems like it's the mRNA that's the most effective, that's the most capable of being adapted to address these variants. So getting mRNA technology on the manufacturing and then the distribution side, because this requires refrigeration, which requires more complicated logistical networks. So working with logistics companies, working with all these other kind of suppliers to help kind of with the supply chain in these countries is really critical, but you just haven't seen that effort. You haven't seen that focus, which is disappointing, because when we talked about this last spring, it seemed like, hey, there's going to be this effort with the Quads, with India and Japan and the US are going to have this coordinated effort. And it just hasn't come to fruition in the way that it should have. So I think there's this opportunity. There's still an opportunity to have a strategic win, to show the material. And I think you brought up an important point. And China understands that it's the material benefits that its system, that its government delivers is important. And our model has not been delivering those goods, not domestically, because the gains have come too far to the top 1%. And not internationally either, because we've abandoned all sort of development projects of building other nations, which, again, out of self-interest, we should be pursuing.
Absolutely. And anyway, I'm very disappointed in us. Not only the United States, but the West should put more pressure on these companies and their patents. I mean, they're making crazy profits. They are profiting off a time of crisis. And again, I'm the, mostly capitalist one here. I mean, very much pro-capitalism no, I'm not saying between the two of us, but I mean, I'm very, very pro that. But, political economics is that there are times, like a global health emergency is a time where you'd want Moderna to make profits, but not crazy profits. And all of that should be shared instead of hoarded just for their own profit making. And what is the U.S. supposed to be a leader of, right? It's not good enough to just say, oh, we're a leader of these ideals. If we can't help you with anything, if we're going to just leave you on your own, what reason should they have any buy-in in our system, right? And saying that this is supposed to be for global justice and such.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is something we understood during the Cold War, that it was this competition between two different systems, and it was fought on economic, diplomatic, cultural, charity, whatever. It was fought on kind of all arenas. And we just don't have that strategy there. We don't have that sort of mindset. So I think, if it sounds good, I think that's probably a good segue into our second topic in terms of the year in review and around the U.S.-China strategy. So Anita's going to walk through, a couple different articles from Foreign Affairs, kind of framing this discussion, and then some of the issues, because obviously the entire foreign policy establishment within the U.S. has shifted focus away from the Middle East to China, and kind of what strategy is kind of building up around that. So Anita, do you want to give a little background about that?
Yes. So this year there's been a lot of discussion on what the U.S. strategy towards China would be. So some people thought that after Trump we'd be hearing less about China, but we've definitely been hearing more about China. And I think a strategy that is not hampered by nationalistic politics, but one that recognizes a rising China and its desire and its activities to have more control over the Asian region, and the rest of the world. And how does the U.S. handle a rivalry that should also be one where we find strategic partnership in as well? And part of the debate is, do we emphasize one or the other? Should we just be preparing for China to confront the United States or confront the West in a variety of ways to gain autonomy, to gain power over its affairs? Or do we recognize that we can have shared points of engagement while also being able to handle rivalries and defending particular interests? So even as we've talked about, before I get into the Mersheimer argument, we focus so much on defense and the military discussion instead of looking at it as like even a global competition over the rules-based system of capitalism and democracy, which we've tried to set out. China certainly isn't just competing militarily. It's, providing goods and trying to offer its own model of the world. But all of this, when we talk about competition and rivalry, I've said we keep framing China as the enemy. And I think it's really dangerous and only sort of leads to that kind of confrontation that we could otherwise avoid, because there are many areas of cooperation, including trade, that we should still be pursuing. But foreign affairs is where a lot of scholars and practitioners and policy like to air out their ideas. And one of the most famous scholars is John Mersheimer. Said he is the father of offensive realism, which is the dominant theory in international relations, which says that the global system is an anarchy because there is no sole authority. And thus, that means every state tries to guarantee its security by becoming the number one power. And there is no question about what states' motives are in realism. This is contrasted generally in the theory of international relations that is often oversimplified, which states things like states may have other goals, such as economic development, beyond just pure power, particularly in terms of military power, and that when we have more engagement, the more ties, particularly economic ties, then the costs of war are greater, right? So if you are sharing beneficial trading ties, then if you went to war to solve your differences, then you would be losing more than just the cost of military and cost of lives. And so it provides incentive for states to find other ways to handle their disputes. And there are definitely many disputes. And sometimes these interactions are actually create more disputes. But how they're handled is very important. And I think that's a good overview, right? Good quick summary.
Yeah, no, I think that is good. I mean, I think, it is interesting that, so you're saying realists don't really take into account economics and trade as part of the power framework, or how would you?
Only as it relates to military power. Like a greater economy has the resources to have a greater military.
Okay.
I mean, there might be more nuance in other scholars, but as the originator, Mersheimer in this article in Foreign Affairs, The Inevitable Rivalry, America, China, and the Tragedy of Great Power Politics, makes it clear that he is defining this very much in terms of military power, because the problem is as China grew to greater economic power, it allowed them to have more military capabilities. So he argues in a way that really had people scratching their heads in the China scholar community across the spectrum in Washington, D.C., that the United States made this grievous mistake after the end of the Cold War by continuing to engage with China. That during the Cold War, it made sense because they could play China off of the Soviet Union. But afterwards, the United States should have seen that China was the most likely country to gain significant power to possibly challenge the United States. And having recognized that, then realist theory would tell them that they should have done everything to prevent China's economic rise. So he argues that if U.S. policymakers had accepted the logic of realism, then these were the policies it should have carried out. So we talked, I think, in last episode a little bit about China's MFN status, most favored trade nations, and how it had to be renewed every year. He believes that after the Cold War in 1980, towards the end of the 80s, then the U.S. should have stopped the most favored nation status and instead negotiated a new bilateral trade agreement that imposed harsher terms on China. Although why China would agree to this is unclear. Even if the agreement was less favorable to the U.S., given the small size of the Chinese economy, it would have taken a bigger hit than the U.S. economy. So it definitely also should not then have been let into the WTO. Basically, he argues you would limit China's access to the international trading system, and that you would also enlist allies such as Japan and Taiwan, reminding them that a powerful China would pose an existential threat to them. It's not an existential threat to Japan in any way, but this is his argument. He said that it would have still eventually risen, but it would not be in a position to seek regional hegemony. What is kind of astounding about this is that it undermines the entire U.S. post-World War II order that had been set up, right? That gave all countries to participate in a global system where they could benefit, right? That they could participate in, and it would not be zero sum, that there would be trade and both sides would get basic global structure of rules, so every country wasn't fearful that their neighbor was going to attack them.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But, I mean, why doesn't China fall into that camp of essentially a communist or a country that's a unique threat to the United States and thus shouldn't be included within that system? Because everything that you've kind of read out with Mersheimer, if you were to poll the American people and say, hey, is this what we should have done? You'd have like 80% of people say absolutely. Now, mind you, that'd mean a lot higher domestic prices for consumer goods. So maybe they would, be like, I don't like that. But they'd say, hey, we kept more manufacturing in the United States. There's more middle-class jobs.
I have two responses to that. One, this goes way, way, way beyond what prices are. Two, it would not have kept jobs because they would have still gone through technology or gone to Mexico. It was Mexico who really lost out on China's WTO. So you're Brazil or, I don't know, any other country, and you see the U.S. pick a potential power right? One that didn't have power yet, but one you could see that could grow in like 3 decades and challenge you, and try to destroy it.
What country is that? The only one that has the population capacity to do that besides China is India. India is a democracy, not really, and
but would they be a democracy under this situation? Because what you are saying is you are actually creating a system of anarchy where there is no trust in the system, where large powers can totally try to isolate you and destroy you simply because they think you might be a future threat. I mean, this is the sort of antagonistic thinking, zero-sum thinking that was there prior to World War I, which is what Mersheimer bases his whole theory on, his own story of World War I. But one reason people argue that Germany invaded France was because it was wary of a growing Franco-Russian alliance that could eventually be more powerful than Germany and counter its interests, right? Like, you want, in that scenario, you have to invade before another power becomes too big to invade you.
Yeah, I mean, Mersheimer is saying that in our unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War, you eliminate China as a threat. There is no challenge. There's only the United States. The United States is almost for the next 100 years, the global hegemon.
But you would have all these countries that were likely to bandwagon against you, right?
They're not a threat to the United States. They don't have the capacity to be a threat. Only China had the capacity to be a threat. It's just a population thing. It's just they have 1.3 billion and the economic capacity to grow a military.
Well, maybe then they create their own alliance among, I don't know.
No, they're still benefiting under the global system that the United States set up. Every other nation that's not a direct threat to U.S. global hegemony.
Why not create a new alliance like the Soviet Union had?
Not feasible or worth it.
Why?
Because they're benefiting under the global system.
Were there other countries benefiting? Did they clearly see a benefit under the global system? Or could China argue to many of them that, look, the U.S. is out to get us, right? The U.S. is not into providing global benefits. It is purely about power, and it will go after you if it thinks you are countering its interest in any way.
I think if it was managed in a way to just isolate a single nation like China, they're not going to get a lot of traction.
Though. You just cannot do it. There's no way we could have had a scenario where you isolate just one country and everyone else thinks that you wouldn't isolate them if they did or said something that went against your interest. It creates fear, and fear creates insecurity where countries do feel the need to have to not only go to war over current conflicts, but over potential threats in the future. You don't have to have global hegemons. You have like fighting within Latin America for, hegemony there.
No, there's no fighting. There's just the U.S. The U.S. is the global hegemon.
No, because you still have the U.S. You still have countries within Latin America, unless the U.S. decides like, oh, this one country, we're going to support these countries. I mean, the people are still positioning for power.
So you're just saying it would drive things interregionally.
Because there's no cooperation. I mean, you are eliminating a system of cooperation.
You still have all the systems of cooperation set up from World War II. You're just isolating, similar to the Cold War, you're just isolating a single country.
Right, but people are not going to trust in that system.
Well, they trusted the U.S. during its isolation of all the communist nations during the Cold War.
Because the Soviet Union declared itself as an enemy. It wasn't like we're preventing a new enemy, a new threat from occurring. It was a threat.
Yeah, I mean, I could see your point, especially the time frame that he talks about. And what I really question is, was he really advocating this back in the 90s, to your knowledge?
I don't know. So there's two things. And I didn't even talk about the inhumanity, right? Like 300 million people were lifted out of poverty.
Absolutely.
300 million. It was the biggest gains in the reduction of poverty
reduction.
At any other period of time. And again, the U.S. is hegemon. We're acting like it was the hegemon purely to project military power. But that has never been the U.S.'s main form of hegemony. You have to have some moral authority, some soft power to go with it. And by doing this, you would eliminate it. I mean, one of the things the World Trade Organization stopped really progressing was in the 2000s when the developing nations felt like the developed nations were having trade deals that advantaged them, or, that was protecting their agriculture and not allowing the developing countries where they had natural benefits in to be able to trade those things. That it was an unequal system. Imagine if the U.S. had done this to China before that. There would be no world trade system. Like, you would have never gotten cooperation from developing nations to trust each other enough to enter a trade agreement if it knew that the U.S. would take these kind of actions. We wouldn't have stood for anything. We wouldn't have stood for, made anyone believe that we cared about lifting the world out of poverty, about global health, about like a system that does require some trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point about that. I mean, the U.S., when it emerged from kind of its period isolation and had to take this global role following World War II, it was an extension of, for us to secure our interest, our way of life, we have to establish these values, these systems where we operate in the world. That makes for a more stable world, which ensures the peace for the U.S. And it also helps, obviously, it helps U.S. businesses and the consumer overall, through access to new markets.
It was the military after World War II who were some of the biggest proponents of the Marshall Plan, as well as the early agreements that led to the EU, right? So it started out with the Common Coal and Steel Community, which would unify Germany and France. I mean, the military, strategically, we knew at the end of World War II that we needed to create a system where there was some room for international cooperation. And, you started with the coal and steel. That created a system of trust for France and Germany. The idea was to prevent France and Germany ever threatening Europe with war again. And that required to establish trust. And trade is a way that did establish trust and mutual incentives for these countries to work out their problems.
Yeah, and I think, Mersheimer would acknowledge that, and that was the liberal impulse for doing these things. But I think the other thing he mentions in the article is that this has obviously failed. So instead of the reform that was expected with integrating China into the international system, with a China that's growing in prosperity, now has a GDP of $10,000 a year, so it's kind of reached this middle income level. But instead of there being kind of liberal reforms domestically, you've just seen absolute retrenchment, especially with the rise of Xi Jinping to power. So you have an increasingly authoritarian state of enormous military power, growing military power because of its huge economy. So Mersheimer is saying, well, it was a nice thought, it was a nice theory, but it's failed. So how would you?
He doesn't even say that, actually. He says, I quote, "Beguiled by misguided theories about liberalism's inevitable triumph and the obsolescence of great power conflict, both Democrats and Republican administrations pursued a policy of engagement which sought to help China grow richer. Washington promoted investments in China and welcomed the country into global trading systems, thinking it would become a peace-loving democracy and a responsible stakeholder in a U.S.-led international order." Now, yes, so he's not just saying, oh, that's a nice theory. He's saying, it
was garbage from the beginning, right. Which I want to see that article back in the 90s saying that.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay. As long as he's consistent.
But here's the thing. Trading with China, no one ever was pursuing. No, we never did it to make China rich. Like, he makes it sound like, oh, we had this fantasy that they would play by our rules as long as we made sure that they were rich, and then they would become a peace-loving democracy. We never traded with China for it. Like, the goal was never to be a peace-loving democracy. The goal was to make money, right? I mean, the goal was for economic benefits.
And we kind of failed at that too, at least in terms of how those benefits were distributed. Because those all went to, some of it went to the consumer, but, to your point, we would have gotten the consumer benefits manufacturing in Mexico or Southeast Asia or some other country. But I would argue that in terms of like how Congress talked about it, it was always about the liberalization project. It was always about liberalization, and that this was a long-term strategy to change China. I mean, that's the reason we didn't do this whole drowning them in the bathtub after Tiananmen.
No, we made a lot of money through trade. It's not just special interest, right? I mean, generally, all sectors of the economy benefited.
China's been a disappointing place for investment for U.S. businesses. It's not been like phenomenal because it's so restrictive.
So
and
first,
they don't open up their
that's a
markets.
Good point, because I was first talking about trade. But of course, economic contraction is a lot about investment, and companies have. So one of my colleagues saying at, I'll put it in the show notes, the University of Kansas, I believe, his dissertation work, I listened to a paper that he gave recently at a conference, and it was about looking at during Trump's trade war, how did companies respond? And they actually increased federal direct investment, meaning they actually increased their investments in China, their factory productions in China. So that kind of counters some of your argument about, well, it's not been a good investment. A lot of companies have benefited. But then these companies are the ones who do employ workers. We don't have the factory jobs, but these same companies they do employ, thousands, hundreds of thousands US. I mean, not everybody is working on the manufacturing floor. To say that the US did not gain is ridiculous. We gained a ton. I feel like now I have to go make a chart and put it with the show notes. But
no, I'm not saying we didn't gain, but that gain went to a very small portion of the population, and China gained far more. And then strategically, the U.S. has lost a lot, to Mersheimer's point.
Well, I disagree, that China has benefited much more.
They've definitely benefited a lot more than the United States from this relationship.
All right. Well, that will probably have to be on a further episode. Yep. I also want to say that a lot of the reaction in DC of people I talked to was, this is why practitioners hate academics when it comes to thinking about actually policy prescriptions. Because everyone responded negatively to this. I was talking to many of them about my interest in kind of middle theories and producing work that actually is not at this high level of theory, but can also
because you're talking about you're in one ideological camp, and you're committed to that as an academic and arguing from this single worldview, as opposed to policy, which is kind of is that what you mean by kind of middle or mix? So,
offensive realism is sort of a description. It's a framework, a very high level framework of international relations, right? It's that versus liberalism, and constructivism is another large theory, which is arguing that increased interaction creates trust. And I don't want to go into exactly the basics, but it's that high level, right? And then Mersheimer is trying to take that high level and then apply it to actual policies, that if we believed in realism, this is what we'd do. And you should never say, oh, this theory can be applied to this specific policy. It's very bad. Practitioners and policymakers really hate it when academics try to come down on high and try to tell them, oh, this is the policy advice. And so I feel like, there's a lot of tension then between the two worlds. I totally feel there's a place in academia to do that kind of work, high-level theory. But there also needs to be a lot more focus on respecting scholarship that takes those theories and either, helps us understand them better by, bringing in the actors, even a third stage that looks at findings that can be relevant when we're making policies towards these countries. But you can't just take offensive realism and then policy prescriptions toward China. And like I said, I feel like then he just creates everything he says just sets up the world for conflict.
Well, no, definitely interesting perspective. It's always good getting your thoughts on kind of that conflict between academia and the policy world.
Well, we have gone over time. We probably will have to find a way to cut this down.
Yep. It's going to be a challenge.
We hope you all have a very Merry Christmas.
Yep. Merry Christmas, everybody. Happy New Year.
So this brings us to the end of the episode. You can visit our website at www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg, or me at AR Kellogg.
Yeah, and you can also reach out to us by email. So Anita's is Anita@kellogglobalpolitics.com, and mine is Ryan@kellogglobalpolitics.com. And as always, please see the show notes for all the articles that we discussed in the episode, and then leave a rating on your podcast provider and a review if you get the chance. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, good New Year, everybody.